Chapter 5 is going to talk about biodiversity. Your book opens with the story of the dung of the devil, which in 1918 and 1920 there was a Spanish flu, unprecedented flu outbreak. Mortality estimates between 20 and 100 million worldwide. In China, they found the roots of a particular plant referred to as the dung of the devil because it smelled really bad, the roots did, was able to fight the flu. The H1N1 virus, called the Spanish flu, which is similar to the swine flu outbreak, they revisited this plant and found that it also has similar properties able to help fight this new form of flu. Other important medicines for treating a variety of cancers: rosy periwinkle, found only in the tropical forests of Madagascar, is the source of 2 drugs that treat childhood leukemia and Hodgkin's disease. The mayapple, a common herb in the eastern United States, is the source of 2 anti-cancer drugs. Many new medicines, including anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and anti-tumor drugs, have come from a variety of invertebrate animals that inhabit coral reefs, including sponges, corals, and sea squirts. The most promising candidates for current new drugs, 70%, were first discovered in plants, animals, and microbes. Unfortunately, many species are either known or suspected sources of drugs are being lost to deforestation, agriculture, other human activities. There's millions of species on Earth, and only a small fraction has been screened for useful drugs. And this is why this idea of biodiversity is so important. Earth is home to a tremendous diversity of species. There's ways that we can look at diversity. We can look at ecosystem diversity, which is the variety of ecosystems within a given region. We can break that down to species diversity, which is the variety of species in a given ecosystem, and then to genetic diversity, which is the variety of genes within a given species. So diversity among individuals. All 3 scales of biodiversity contribute to the overall biodiversity of the planet. How many species live on Earth? Species is a group of organisms that is distinct from other groups in terms of size, shape, behavior, or biogeochemical properties, so they must be able to reproduce. Problems estimating population size to date: approximately 2 million species are named, but we estimate that the current total number of species is between 5 and 100 million. And that's just an example of the diversity here on Earth, which is outstanding when you look at it all in one picture. It's just this small smattering of things. Definitions: 2 measures to help determine diversity. These are important to the APES test. One is species richness, which is the number of species in a given area, and also species evenness, which is the measure of whether a particular ecosystem is numerically dominant by one species or all are represented by similar numbers of individuals. You have to evaluate those together. We did this when we looked at the cars in the parking lot. We looked to see the number of species that the faculty lot had and the student lot had, and we looked to see the evenness. Was there one type of car that dominated as opposed to it being evenly spread out? If we're looking at evolutionary relationships among species, phylogenies, which are branching patterns of evolutionary relationships, can be described in a diagram, a phylogenetic tree. The relatedness of species is determined by the similarity of the traits, and so you can look at the branching points and see how evolution has occurred. The Museum of Natural History is set up as a phylogenetic tree, which is pretty cool if you go into New York City and you walk the phylogenetic tree. We did that this summer. Evolution is the mechanism underlying biodiversity. Evolution is a change in the genetic composition over a population over time. It occurs at multiple levels. It occurs as microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is evolution below the species level. Macroevolution is evolution which gives rise to new species or new family, class, or phyla. It depends on the genetic diversity that we're starting with. When you're creating genetic diversity, we're looking at genes, we're looking at genotypes. Genes are the physical locations on the chromosomes within each cell of an organism. A genotype is the complete set of genes in an individual. 2 processes that create genetic diversity, which can occur in an organism's lifetime, is a mutation, which is a random change in the genetic code, and recombination, when chromosomes are duplicated during meiosis. It doesn't create new genes, but new combinations. The phenotype is the actual set of traits that's expressed. Its anatomy, its physiology, its behavior. It's affected by both genes and environmental conditions. Evolution occurs by three main ways: artificial selection, natural selection, and random processes. Artificial selection is what we do when we breed specific animals. Humans determine which ones are going to mate and reproduce. The classic example is dogs. We have taken the wolf and broken into many, many different dog breeds. We select those dogs for desired traits and then breed them together. So those are examples. Unintended consequences are resistance. If we keep breeding the same breed of dogs with low genetic diversity to bring out a certain trait, those dogs will also carry things like, if they're going to have hip dysplasia or breathing problems or whatever other traits go along with that organism, those will also be magnified. Wild mustard led us to cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, or brassicas. Evolution by natural selection. The natural environment determines which individuals are most likely to survive and reproduce. The adaptations are traits that improve fitness, and so those allow those organisms to naturally reproduce. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is that individuals produce excess of offspring. Not all the offspring can survive, and the ones that have different traits, the differences in traits can be passed on, and the traits that allow those organisms to survive best allow those organisms to then reproduce. He saw this all with his Galapagos finches. All these finches descending from a similar finch, but then they all adapted in order to eat different things. And so there had beak adaptations, head size adaptations, and where they lived adaptations. And then finally, we have evolution by random processes. It doesn't relate to a change in fitness. These four things are mutation. They occur randomly. They can add to the genetic variation of a population, and they can be continued to be spread on if it's genetic. Genetic drift is changes in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mating. Bottleneck effect is a reduction in the genetic diversity of a population caused by a reduction in its size. So if a bunch of a certain organism get killed off, only the ones that are still alive are going to be able to breed and reproduce. Founder effect is a change in population descended from a small number of colonizing individuals. A few get separated from the group and therefore start their own group and have more limited gene pool to pull from. Here's images that show all of those things. Mutations can show there's a random mutation that causes one rat to be black, and through generations that is allowed to reproduce. Genetic drift. In a large population, the genetic composition tends to remain the same over time. In a small population, genotypes can be lost by genetic chance. Okay, so if these dark-colored rats don't reproduce as much, it will change, whereas in a larger population, that's not likely to happen. Bottleneck effect. If a population experiences a drastic decrease in size, goes through a bottleneck, there's some sort of something that kills off all of these rats and just leaves these three, then the new population from this bottleneck will have much different color patterns than the original population had. Founder effect. These guys got isolated somehow on an island, and instead of having this genetic diversity of 40% black, 10% brown, and 50% white, we have this totally different population of just black and white, and so that will change that population. Speciation and extinction determine biodiversity. So we're moving from microevolution to macroevolution. Allopatric speciation is when a new species are created by geographic or reproductive isolation. Ways to create new species: that geographic isolation, that founder effect that we just spoke about, where we have an island or habitat fragmentation somehow, or reproductive isolation. They can no longer interbreed and produce viable offspring, like Darwin's finches. So these birds changed so much that they no longer could interbreed with each other. Speciation and extinction determine biodiversity. So Sympatric speciation, the evolution of one species into two species in the absence of geographic isolation, usually through polyploidy, more genes, an increase in the number of the sets of chromosomes. This is an example in wheat. So we have this flowering plants such as wheat commonly form new species through the process of polyploidy. The ancestral einkorn wheat has two sets of chromosomes and produces small seeds. So that's the first one. Durum wheat, which is used to make pasta, was bred to have four sets of chromosomes and produces medium-sized seeds. And common wheat, which is used mostly for bread, was bred to have six sets of chromosomes and produces the largest seed. They cannot interbreed with their diploid ancestors. Pace of evolution, it's a long time, hundreds to millions of years. Influence of four factors on successful adaptation is the rate of environmental change. A slowly changing environment gives species more time to adapt to changes. Genetic variation. Less genetic variation means there's less chance for the species to adapt to changing conditions. If there's more genetic variation, then they have more of a chance to adapt. Population size. If a beneficial mutation occurs, it can spread more rapidly in a small population than a large population. So if something is good and there's only a few that have it and they can breed, that will magnify faster. Generation time. Shorter generation times. If an organism lives 100 years, it's going to take a long time to pass that. But if it's something that is seasonal, those beneficial mutations may occur and they allow them to spread faster through a population. Evolution by artificial selection is faster than natural selection. I think that sort of makes sense that we just go ahead and because we're choosing. Evolution occurs more rapidly in populations of genetically modified organisms. So genetic engineering scientists are inserting genes from one organism into another. We'll visit this in more depth when we look at food. But United States and Canada do not require labeling of genetically engineered foods. In 50 countries, there are significant restrictions on or the outright ban on GMOs. That will be a whole topic of discussion when we start looking more specifically at genetically modified organisms. Evolution determines shapes, ecological niches, and determines species distributions. There's a range of tolerance. So if we look at the abiotic conditions, so what the weather is, what the climate is, what the humidity is, the abiotic conditions that an organism can tolerate, all organisms have an optimal environment. The fundamental niche is the ideal conditions of a species. They can survive and grow here, and they can just survive here. And they can survive and grow here, and they can just survive here. But if they're going to survive and grow and reproduce, this is the perfect conditions. And this is a good bell graph, something that the APES test would like to show you. A realized niche is the range of abiotic and biotic conditions under which a species lives. It determines the species distribution. A niche generalist is a species that lives under a wide range of conditions, and a niche specialist is a species that only lives in specific habitats. So a specialist, they're very specific, as opposed to a generalist, which has more of a range of places that it can live. You can also hear that pronounced niche, depends where you're from. You can hear it called niche is more common in the United States, but is also pronounced as niche. Changes in environmental conditions may affect the species distribution. Species vary in their ability to adapt and move physically. Animals can get up and move move to where their niche is a better place. Trees and things like that can't get up and just move. They can change, but it's much slower. And we're looking at pine and spruce and birch and how they've changed from being lesser to greater abundance, looking at many years ago, spans of 6,000 years ago. Predicting future species distribution, we try to predict how distributions might change as a result of future changes in environmental conditions. If we look at the red pine, the current distribution is here. If it becomes too warm, the red pine is predicted to not be anywhere around here at 2100. The loblolly pine, which likes warmer climates, will be able to sort of migrate itself north as if global warming continues at the rate that it is. Species that cannot adapt go extinct. 99% of all species that ever lived on Earth are now extinct. Why do species go extinct? Human destruction. We know about the evolution of life from the fossil record. Fossils are remains of organisms, and there's been 5 global mass extinctions so far. that we know of, and the big one that we're talking about is the sixth mass extinction, that we are in that in the last 2 decades because humans